Award-winning author Ladee Hubbard has written a riveting new book on Black love, family, and resilience. And she joins me today to discuss The Last Suspicious Holdout. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Ladee Hubbard has written several novels, and she's the winner of multiple awards for her literary excellence. She is out with a new book that has been described as a kind of diary for the Black community. And I'm so excited to sit down with her to discuss The Last Suspicious Holdout. Good morning and welcome, Ladee.
Oh, good morning.
So, Ladee, I don't know what you're thinking in this moment, but this book, this collection of short stories that you've written that's been described as it's kind of a diary for the Black community. It's really a book about Black resilience. And I'm thinking in this moment when we are seeing so much anti-Blackness coming from both Democrats, if you've been following the story happening in Los Angeles with the racist rant caught on audio of 3 Latino council members, and you look at what's happening with some of the MAGA candidates who have been just espousing anti-Blackness during their primary campaigns. What are you thinking about this imaginary community in this book, and how would some of your characters respond to what is happening in our world today?
That's interesting how they would respond, because I mean, it's interesting. I spent such a long time writing it, and it's actually, it ends right on the eve of Obama's election. And I really, the fact that it came out when it did, I really do see, and I think a part of me must have sensed a connection between what was going on back then and what is going on now. So I don't know, because I feel a lot of the book has to do with the difficulty of kind of articulating or talking directly about sort of racism, the persistence of racism, because we passed through this moment that was supposedly post-racial, and clearly there was a lot that was unreconciled, and it wasn't, I think part of what's going on in the book is it's sort of a difficulty addressing that directly. So I do think there's a connection. Like, I don't think the moment we're in sort of just happened, that there's a connection between things that were going on during the period where the book takes place and now. So
yeah, it's so interesting. You said it took you a long time to write the book. What was your initial inspiration for The Last Suspicious Holdout?
Well, I started writing the stories in it actually in 2009. I realized that was when the very first story in the collection was published in 2009, I think. So I've been writing it for a while, and a lot of it was my reaction to Obama's election and the way it was talked about, and that it was so incredibly meaningful for so many people for obvious reasons. And I think it was in part me trying to work through my own cynicism about it. Do you know what I mean?
So, absolutely. What were you feeling when you just say your cynicism? What were you feeling in 2009 about the 2008 election? Because you say this book is somewhat self-referential.
I think it was hard for me to trust it. Do you know what I mean? Like, my mother, for example, was so euphoric, and this is a huge moment, the first Black president of the United States, and a lot of people were talking about it in the media and things like this as if it was the culmination of things, and that we'd finally gotten over racism enough to elect a Black president. And I think a lot of it had to do with why I just didn't trust it fully, and just trying to work through why that was.
So what was happening in your immediate circles? Because I know you talked about yourself and your generation, and then you just referenced your mother, so who's of a different generation.
Yeah.
Was there this divide happening where people in your generation were more cynical and older people like your mom and her peers were having this moment where they really thought this was, the dream come true that Dr. King and so many others before him had talked about?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't speak to her. I mean, she's actually a very cynical person herself, but she's not Pollyannish about stuff. But I do think there is something about having grown up. Another thing people call it the post-civil rights generation. So it's kind of like the I don't know, aftermath isn't really the right word. So you're brought up with this tradition of resistance that's very close to you, because it certainly in my case it had it was very real for my parents and stuff like that. And supposedly this is the new reality that you're in. That's sort of the culmination of this. All these formal barriers have broken down, and but there was a lot going on. I think that's a lot of what the book is about, is trying to unpack that particular moment, because there were clearly a lot of things that were very troubling going on, and they were manifesting themselves in very strange ways, I think.
And it's interesting that you're saying these troubling things were going on, because you're talking about starting to write these essays in 2009. So it's just 1 year after this historic election. So already a year in, you're noticing some troubling things. Let's talk about the structure of the book. So you're having these feelings about Obama's election and what it really means versus what people are saying it means. Why this format, the structure that you use, this collection of short stories?
Right. So it's every story is set in a different year. And originally I had wanted there to be 20, and it would go from 20 years prior to the point where it ends. I really just felt I wanted to tell the story of the community. So I wanted it to be in multiple voices, and to sort of see a transformation over time. So it's about the community, but it's about broader issues for me. So, I wanted it to be sort of the story of a community over that period of time. Yeah.
And this community that you select for these characters is this kind of mythical suburban community.
Yeah.
Why the suburbs versus the city? Because when you think about a lot of these characters, they could just as well have been living in a Chicago, New York, a Los Angeles, an Atlanta. But you chose this mythical suburban setting for these interactions between the characters or amongst the characters to take place.
Well, that's just it being rooted very much in my experience, and that's what I'm talking about. So a lot of it is there. I live in New Orleans now, but I spent a lot of time growing up actually in St. Petersburg, Florida, and so a lot of it has to do in terms of the environment is based on that. It's not literally that place. It's not literally a specific place. And there's also a lot of influence of New Orleans, which is where I've lived for, a very long time as an adult. And that's where I lived when I wrote it. So they're sort of merged in that way. But the specific setting definitely speaks to my experience at that time. Yeah.
And I know you also you spent a lot of time in the U.S. Virgin Islands, right?
Yeah. I lived there. Yeah, for several years when I was growing up before high school. Yeah.
Did that have any influence, your time you spent in the Virgin Islands, did that have any impact on, where you decided to, make these characters, where you rooted them?
Where, there's a story, the very first story is there's a character who moved to an island, and then now she's back. And so in a way and that becomes a comment on her displacement. So she feels very displaced because she's not actually West Indian, but she sounds West Indian when she talks to people. And I think I did too when I first came back. So yeah, it's about someone being disrooted. Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about this word resilience and resiliency. And obviously, that's a common theme throughout the book is Black resilience. How has that concept changed? So you're writing about the Clinton to Obama years, essentially, in the book. What did you notice about the change, if any, in terms of Black resilience?
Well, one thing that's very prominent for me in the book is just the way people talked about identity during that period, and so one of the things I was interested in. You kind of had this portrait, and for valid reasons, in a certain respect, that the black identity had become sort of bifurcated in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, so that there were like Blacks who had made it. There were all these images of like Blacks who had made it, and then there were Blacks that were still struggling. And I think a lot of the images that I saw during that period seemed to be putting blame on people who hadn't made it in their behaviors or something that they were doing, because now it's like, no, all these barriers have been broken. There's no formal segregation anymore. And you see these examples of Black success. So you can't say that it's the system or it's structural or something like that. It's something sort of inherent to the Black community. But in a lot of, I think, very potent ways, there was this increased presentation of bifurcation. And also it affected the way people could talk about racial solidarity in general, because if you're highlighting these differences between people, then the idea that race is sort of a salient basis to come together to protest things going on is very severely undermined. And that was a lot of what I saw. I was in graduate school for part of it too. I think it was very hard to talk about race and racism in a really overt way, which is interesting about now, because people do that now. And I noticed that after Obama was elected, is that people started talking about race in a much more overt and direct way, the impact of race, the persistence of racism, even though that it was supposed to have inaugurated a post-racial moment, people are talking about it again as something that's real. Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said about this bifurcation, this concept that there were, two groups of African Americans, one having been this group that quote unquote made it, and the others who had not. Was that, from your perspective and in writing the book, was that bifurcation something that grew organically within the Black community, or was that something that was superimposed on the community? How do you reconcile the two?
I think it was in part, I was interested in the ways it was being superimposed, because I think there have always been a lot of internal differences, and that, Black people are not a monolith. No group of people is, and these are, things that there's certainly differences and things that have to be worked through. But I was really interested in the ways that I thought it was being superimposed and the impact that was having. Yeah. And for example, in terms of superimposition or whatever, a lot of policies, and some of them come up a little bit in the book, that were implemented that had a disproportionate impact on Black people specifically, but they were not talked about in racial terms. So there was sort of this neutrality in terms of the way they were being presented. Which is interesting, because you probably, it would have been more overt. It could have been more overt in the period in the past. You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't want Black people here, or we're going to put, we don't, all this stuff. In a way, I was very interested in what it was doing to language in terms of what was impacting people and also how they could constitute what would be considered a coherent response to it. Yeah.
Well, speaking of language, you definitely deal with these stereotypes that were often used during this period, like the welfare queens or crack babies.
Yes.
And that would be a good example of, the outside superimposing to the African American community, this bifurcation, that there are these people who are welfare queens who won't work, who are out to, abuse and manipulate the system to get governmental resources. And there's this pervasive use of crack cocaine and resulting in the birth of these crack babies, that's the other, versus then there are these quote unquote Obama-like African Americans who are upstanding, hardworking, productive members of society. So in the book, how are your characters dealing with, confronting these realities that they have to deal with in the media, that, they're not immune, whether you fall in category A or category B?
Right. And some of that it comes up overtly. There's a story about the whole, because it's so cruel in retrospect, and it's kind of shocking, to look back, the whole crack baby thing, that the idea that there were just these babies that were being born and they were portrayed in the media as kind of monstrous. Do you know what I mean? And it's just, I don't know, it's kind of horrifying. It's very recent history too, that's how that was talked about. And the idea that if you had a drug addiction, you were inherently a violent, dangerous criminal. Do you know what I mean? That, like, a predator in a way that it's pretty wild to think about. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's dealt with overtly in these, but I really wanted to make them very personal stories. So often that is the context in which they're trying to work through their own personal grief about different issues. Grief is a pervasive theme, and I think that the resiliency is sort of the ability to love, the persistence of love, and to care for each other despite your flaws. Do you see what I'm saying? And so that's sort of the background for a lot of the stories, or the things that are going on around them that are directly impacting them, and it's impacting their relationship. So I was very interested in the characters, the way they were working through their personal issues, as opposed to being focused on the wider context. It's like, how is it being lived and experienced by the people in the book?
Yeah, and it's interesting that those characterizations of crack babies, as you said, when we look back on it, how cruel that was, and it's this painting of these babies, these innocent, what should be innocent children and babies, as monstrous. Going back to what's happening today in Los Angeles, in those leaked audio tapes, there is references to a young black child, as a monkey, and this statement made that he needed to be taken around the corner, or I'll take him around the corner and give him a beat down. But it reckons back to that same characterization that we've seen throughout history of black children as somehow being so unruly, so out of control, that they are animal-like and also in need of this very harsh punishment. And that is a characterization that, way past this era that you write about, these 20 years, still is pervasive in so many of our the way we characterizations of black children. And it's really interesting that, coming forward, that we still are seeing black kids described and talked about in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a big issue. There's a lot of unreconciled I mean, I just think there's a lot that this country really needs to deal with at a certain point. And it's like, I feel like you pretending it's not there or it's not true isn't helpful at all. Yeah.
Well, no, because what happens is no matter what period we talk about, there are these moments where we are in conversations about dismantling systemic racism where we're more honest about the existence of it. And then that moment fades and we see these ugly stereotypes, rear their ugly heads.
Right.
So whether it's your book and talking about, 20 years leading up to 2009 or October of 2021, and the impact, I think what's so significant that we can't lose sight of is how those ugly stereotypes get internalized by other groups. Because when I talk about what's happening in Los Angeles, these are Latinx, these are Latino political leaders who have internalized their vision of Black children from a white supremacist narrative, right? So other groups, and sometimes even internally in the African American community, we speak the language of white supremacists in the way that we describe people in our own community. And so it's interesting to see, again, these Latin leaders, Latin American leaders using the language that is typically associated with white supremacy.
Right.
Monkey, Black people as monkeys. That's pervasive throughout our history when you look at, kind of white supremacy.
Right. And white supremacy is not really confined to the United States also too. Do you know what I mean? Like it's an issue in a lot of, it's an issue in Latin America as well. So it's a huge thing.
Yeah, no, it's just amazing that, again, what was supposed to be our post-racial period is far from post-racial. It's
right.
like racial on steroids. Let's talk about some of the other themes in the book, because you also deal with this tension between privilege in the Black community. Why was that important for you to tackle? Because that's, again, one of those can be taboo topics that make a lot of people uncomfortable.
Right. No, I mean, I do think, it's not a monolith. I don't think the Black community is a monolith, and there certainly are internal issues in terms of the way people treat each other. Right. Mm-hmm. And also there's I'm kind of fascinated by the kind of coping strategies that people come up with, mm-hmm. and that sometimes they're ultimately not positive. They're hurtful. They hurt yourself. They hurt other people around you. And they might very well have their origins, however, in efforts to cope with all the things that people have to deal with. So I think that is something that comes up a lot. Maybe myths and ideas that people tell themselves about themselves and other people that are they are soothing in a certain way, but they don't ultimately serve you best. Yeah.
But were you hoping that by tackling that tension that you could maybe debunk a myth that somehow educated African Americans, you went to Princeton, I went to Harvard, that somehow Black folks that do go to Ivy Leagues or do achieve a certain level of education are separate, that somehow we don't experience Blackness as folks that don't have similar opportunities? I felt like that may have been one of the things you were trying to, debunk that myth.
Yeah, because that for me is just real. But one of the things you sometimes have to deal with is the idea that you're different, right? Other people saying, "Oh, you're in this space. You're the exception." Do you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And honestly, there are ideas that people might have about you within the Black community because you had that experience of being at Harvard or Princeton or something like that. So this is part of of my specific Black experience, but it is still a Black experience, you know? So I think that was just part of me being honest, and sort of the various ways that some of the characters have had to work through that. Going to Harvard does not make you less Black. And what a weird idea if you really unpack that, all that's going on with that. It's pretty crazy, right? So again, it is, I think there's a tendency to try to oversimplify what the Black experience is. And I feel like in terms of discussing it, part of what was important for me was just to respect the complexity of the characters in this book. And they're all very unique people. They have unique perspectives and they have very unique experiences, but they are all still part of a community. And so for me, that's what that was an assertion of. Yeah.
Did you get, Ladee, a different response to the book? I know you've had some incredible reviews of The Last Suspicious Holdout, as well as your other books. You've written The Talented Ribkins and the Ribking, you know, and you've won incredible awards for those books. But has there been a difference in the response from your Ivy League, Princeton fellow alums versus, you know, those folks that didn't go to Ivy League schools, those Black readers who don't have that pedigree, that educational pedigree that you have? Is there any difference in how people receive this book in particular and your other books?
I don't know how. I mean, I am still, because I do try to be really honest about my experience, and I feel like they're all kind of very idiosyncratic books. So I'm always very happy when people seem to understand what I'm trying to do, and when they respond to it. I don't know. They respond to that it's an attempt to be honest about my experience and you know, maybe my reactions to other people's experiences as well. So it's like very personal to me, and I'm still very, very happy that someone appreciates and seems to understand what I'm trying to do. So I feel like I've been very fortunate in terms of the responses I've gotten from other people. So, and
you haven't seen any difference, you know, in terms of, you know, any breakdown based on people's profession or their educational levels?
Not me, but when people come up to me, I don't ask them like,
oh no, you know, you may have gotten people, you know, on social media, people tell it all. Hey, you know, I went to Princeton and I can relate to this, or, you know, I didn't go to Princeton, and, you know, I was just wondering if you had that kind of experience.
Well, people that have approached me are generally not people that have gone to Princeton and stuff like that. So, but I you know, I feel like I've been very fortunate in terms of the way people have responded to it, because it was you know, when I was it took a long time to write it, and it's excuse me, it's a very unusual book. So I just tell you, I'm glad it worked out. I'm very glad it worked out, because it took a very, very long time to do, and it was kind of, you know, when people ask you, what are you doing? I'm writing a collection of stories, and every one of them is set in a different year, and blah, 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 and they're all, you know, told from different perspectives. So yeah, but I don't know. I think people maybe are responding to different things.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
One of the things that people may respond to is, you know, the different subject matters that you tackle. So we talked about, you know, one theme being resilience, love, and grief. But you tackle love not just from a community love, but actual love, you know, intimacy, love between men and women. And you delve into that whole, you know, the Black love, female-male relationship. When one of your stories, Houston and the Blinking What? Why that story, and why did you decide to tackle Black love?
I was just thinking about the ideas that women are, you know, in some heterosexual women, I should say, are often burdened with in terms of what their relationships mean. And defining yourself in terms of a man. And so that story is two women, they're sisters, and they've made very different choices, and neither which have turned out very well. And then ultimately, I think they realized they should have chose themselves. Do you know? They were looking for something very different, but they were both looking for it in a man. And so I was thinking about that, and sometimes the need to just recognize and stay true to the beauty that is in yourself, as opposed to having your value be determined by a man. There's other stuff going on in there in terms of the structure, but that was really what I was thinking about. It's very hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and a part of that, in that story, I know you referenced the women having this almost fairy tale-like vision of what it was going to be like when they were with a man,
Right.
and then having that fairy tale, in some ways, crushed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, having to come to grips with, it's not like the fairy tale. This is not going to have that kind of fairy tale ending.
Right. And both of them were, they're very beautiful, strong women, and I don't think it was even conscious. I think it's just the way they were thinking about themselves, and there's somehow the man would be, I don't know, something almost they created. Right. The man is a symbol of their beauty, and just realizing, oh, maybe I should have focused on my own self.
Was that an experience based on anything that you had dealt with personally? I mean, did you have a similar experience?
I think so. I mean, I think from talking to people, it does happen. And I think it's not always conscious. And for me, in that particular story too, it's part of the structure, because there's something else going on in the house. Like, that story takes place during a party, and they are not the main event. There's something else going on, and they're both peripheral to that. And so it really was about trying to put women and the fact that they are often regarded as peripheral or invisible, and making them the center, right? Mm-hmm. So reconstituting it despite everything else that's going on. And I think there are a lot of ways in which women often are told that they are, or taught, I should say. It's not told, it's taught by, all kinds of messages that they get that they are ultimately somehow peripheral to their relationships with others. And also thinking a lot about the ways in which women are often used to give a man, sort of define who a man is, right? And yet still peripheral. Like, they're not that important, but you kind of need them there as like a basis of support for other people's identities, right? As opposed to being focused on your own experience and your own identity and stuff like that. So there's a lot going on in there for me.
Yeah, that story is a very rich story. And I think for women in particular, I think will appreciate unpacking that story and looking at their own relationships with men. How much of this, what emotions were you feeling? Because in this book, it feels like, the Last Suspicious Holdout, there's joy, obviously a lot of Black joy. Today, we talk a lot about Black joy. There's also Black pain. And when I think about women, I just did a series called The State of Black Women, and I interviewed 6, incredibly powerful national Black female leaders. And this constant theme that was there was Black women embracing their power, but also recognizing there's so much pain that we still experience as women and that we experience as a community. What were you feeling as you were writing these stories and having to grapple with these topics, the topic of grief and, the topic of loss, and the frustration that many people were feeling, recognizing, as you said, that Obama didn't end racism in America.
Right. Well, I think that's I don't know, maybe writing it personally for me, was trying to work through the grief, a sense of grief. And I think a lot of the characters, like if there is something, a through line for all of them, it is an attempt to reconcile grief, right? And in the midst of grief, people are very creative. They produce a lot of beauty. But they're still grieving. So that's something I thought about a lot. And I think it was, again, because there was all this obfuscation in terms of how issues were talked about, I think it was very hard to express that clearly. Yeah. So that definitely was it's a pervasive theme in the book.
I'm thinking back to that period myself, and it was almost like sacrilegious to comment on the fact that we weren't in this post-racial period, or to acknowledge that, Obama was not ending racism in America. People, I remember even my white friends, suggesting that you were being negative, or right, that you weren't on board, or that you somehow were, that you were just the problem, right?
Right.
For calling out the problem, and having a lot of frustration, and finding that it was very difficult to say to people, no, this is not the ending of racism. Don't heap all of that on the shoulders or the backs of this one man. He cannot solve, 400 years of systemic racism in this country. And it would be naive for us to think that this one election is doing that. But people were not trying to hear that. They were resistant to that.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I was in graduate school then, and there was like a period where every time I read like a book that dealt with basically the persistence of racism, in the introduction there'd be almost a long apology for it, like explaining why you were using that term. And that for me was a clear indication that you couldn't just come out and talk about these things, because you could sort of anticipate the ways in which you'd be attacked just for bringing it up, almost,
Oh God, no! I'm sitting here now having deja vu, thinking about that period and how difficult it was. And if you did talk about it, the first thing they would say, "Well, we elected, as you said, this black president and his wife, and his, he has a black wife, and they have black children, and there's a black, mother-in-law or grandmother, and look at all of them in the White House." And those, that example was always, put before you as somehow evidence and proof.
Right. Well, that's why it was kind of fascinating to me that so much of public discourse changed in a totally, I guess, unexpected way, or certainly a way that, you weren't supposed to be anticipating, how much that changed during his presidency, that people actually started talking about the persistence of racism and systemic racism again, so sort of openly and forcefully, right? Because the things have been going on the whole time. The same, not the same, but kind of the same. People have been dealing with a lot of violence and stuff for a very long time, but all of a sudden now people started talking about it openly and in a very different way.
Yeah, and then we saw those horrific racist attacks on Michelle Obama during that period. Right. The vile attacks on her, again, references to her like a monkey, an ape, an animal. So that brief moment where we were suspended, where in time, where we were post-racial, ended so quickly. And we moved to this very ugly period. And I feel like that ugly period has been amplified. And now, we are 10 years, post Obama's election, maybe even more. And it feels like we are in some ways worse as a country, or in a position that's worse than we were even before his election. It's kind of full circle experience. Ladee, what do you want people to take away from this book, this incredible book, The Last Suspicious Holdout? What's the top 3 things you want people to leave with?
Oh, wow. Well, again, for me, it's a very loving portrait, ultimately, of a community, and it's an expression of my appreciation and gratitude for all the things that I derived from it. And not always pleasant things, but I appreciate them because they shaped who I am very, very deeply, and they mean a lot to me. And I think when I wrote it, it was even, again, things that were hard or difficult as part of a process of understanding, what was that all about? Where was that coming from? And it is about a community where a lot of people in it are in pain. And I think that the more I explored that, or you think about that, then you will have even greater respect and appreciation, again, not just for the resiliency, but the beauty and love that people manage to manifest and create out of that as a response to that, right? Not giving up. The amount of imagination and creativity that has been required of Black people to survive a lot of the things that they have been through. It's phenomenal to think about and to feel that, and to have that resonate with you. So it's an expression of gratitude, and I hope an acknowledgement, right? That I see, and I'm trying to understand things again that are very difficult often, in terms of how people interact with each other. So all respect. That's really what the book is. And I'd like people to acknowledge and appreciate the complexity of Black life and what it means to be a Black person in the United States. Yeah.
Well, what a timely book. Thank you so much for writing it, for sharing how you were thinking, because the way you were thinking about this period, I can tell you so many people were right there with you, having very similar thoughts. Many not able to get a book published or to write what they were feeling, but they will appreciate that you were able to get this done. What's next, Ladee? Obviously, you've written some incredible books that have been well received. You've won amazing prizes and awards for your literary excellence. Any thoughts of turning any of these novels into TV or movie projects?
Oh, yeah, no, I would love that. I would love that. And there is some talk of the first novel, the Talented Ribkins, but I have to wait and see how that turns out. So I mostly just sit here and keep writing. So wonderful. That's what I like to do.
So a new book is on the horizon as well?
Yeah, always.
Any secrets you can tell us? Anything about that book? When it's going to drop? What it's about?
Oh, I don't know. No, I'm still working on it. So.
Okay. Well, when you are done, we'd love to have you back to talk about it. I love what you are doing. I love the characters that you develop. I love the themes that you focus on. And I want to make sure everybody goes out and picks up a copy of The Last Suspicious Holdout. And when you're at the bookstore picking up that book, you'll find some of the other titles that she has written, The Ribking and The Talented Ribkins, your first novel. Again, thank you so much for joining me this morning, and best of luck to you with that next book.
Yeah, no, it's great talking with you.
My best. I want to thank author Ladee Hubbard for joining me this morning and sharing her thoughts about her new book, The Last Suspicious Holdout. This is an incredible collection of short stories that deal with so many issues that are front and center today, issues of Black resilience, Black love, how Black folks, the Black community, deals with issues of grief and pain. I hope everyone goes out and picks up a copy of this book. And while you're there, as I said, the bookstore, there are other titles that this award-winning author, Ladee Hubbard, has written. She is an incredible novelist, and her books, the characters, they come to life in a way that I think so many people will identify with. And these topics are so relevant. Who would have known that today we'd be talking about powerful political leaders in Los Angeles caught on audio tape making racist comments about Black folks and really displaying their anti-Blackness. And that's happening at the same time that a U.S. Senator Tuberville, is also making racist comments, and other MAGA elected officials and folks who want to be elected officials on the Republican side. There seems to be this notion that people can just unleash all of this racist rhetoric and do so without accountability. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope all of these people who think it's okay to, one, be racist, and then to, two, blatantly display that racism in their comments and their conduct. I hope that this country is ready to send a message, and does send a message to these people, that this conduct is unacceptable, will not be tolerated, and that you will pay a price for this kind of white supremacy in action. And Ladee Hubbard, in her book, even though she's writing this book, or wrote this book starting in 2009, its themes today are as relevant as they were in 2009. So make sure you pick up a copy of this book. Just some quick words to goodbye before I get out. My good friend, and she's a friend in my mind because I've never personally met her, but I feel like she's a friend, a mentor, and even an auntie, a family member, Dr. Maya Angelou. She told us, when people show you who they are, believe them. Really simple. Don't make excuses. Don't obfuscate. Don't stick your head in the sand. Believe them. And so many people in this moment are showing us who they are, and sadly, unfortunately, or maybe even realistically, or maybe it's a breath of fresh air, we have to believe them. And maybe by believing them, Dr. Phil always says you can't fix what you don't acknowledge. So by believing them, we are acknowledging the hurt and pain that they are experiencing and that they want to project onto others. So we have to believe them. We have to acknowledge it, because it's in that moment that we can fix it. Be safe out there, and remember, we're all in this together.